Welcome back to History Secrets Uncovered. I'm your host, Jay Chandarana, and today we're diving into one of the most transformative periods in American history, the Civil War and its aftermath. We are here with Professor Wingert, a historian who has written extensively on slavery, emancipation, and the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, as well as the complicated story of the Freedmen's Bureau. Together, we'll explore the aftermath of the Civil War and how enslaved and free Black Americans used the law and federal authority in ways that often surprise us, and what these hidden histories reveal about power, justice, and the ongoing struggles over freedom in America. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jay. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, to begin, when people hear Civil War, they often think about specific battles between the North and South, like Gettysburg, for example. From your perspective as a historian, is it just as important to study what's happening in schools, churches, and courtrooms during this time? And if so, why?
It's a great question. So I think when a lot of people think about Civil War history, they think of kind of the guns and drums and military history and where was this regiment at this time during the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of Shiloh. And that stuff is important, but I think one of the things that the field of Civil War history has really moved in this direction over the past couple decades is thinking about the war and also just kind of the Civil War era more holistically as this period of massive social change. Really, historians have done a great job over the past few decades of emphasizing emancipation and the Black freedom struggle as central to the Civil War. I do a lot of military history. I also do a lot of social, political history. I kind of study the intersection between enslaved peoples' quest for freedom during the war and the Union Army and Union military's efforts to win the war and how those two things intersected. So, absolutely, it's just as important to discuss what was going on off the battlefield. There's this idea that's also prevalent in scholarship of the new military history, which sees, not just armies as armies on a battlefield, but also as reflections of the societies from which they came. So, to really understand the Confederate Army, we have to understand the politics, within the Confederate nation, or vice versa.
And touching on that, the politics of the Confederate nation, how is that kind of reflected in schools, churches, and courtrooms as opposed to just the battlefield, which a lot of us know already more about than the other stuff?
Sure. So a lot of us know about, the Confederate Army. There's famous generals like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Beauregard. I think what taking that kind of new military history approach and looking at the Confederate society reveals is just how riven with internal divisions it was. In some ways, it's remarkable. I always think it's remarkable the Confederacy lasted as long as it did. Obviously, there's the external pressure of the Union Army pushing into it. But Jefferson Davis is not a very popular president. He has a little brief moment of kind of a honeymoon period after, the secession initially happens. But the Confederacy gets tripped over debates about whether or not to exempt wealthy slaveholders from military service. A lot of poor and kind of middle class white Southerners, they are on board for fighting a war to protect slavery, but they get upset and kind of these class tensions start to arise when they feel like wealthy slaveholders are trying to sit the war out while they're the ones who stand to benefit the most. So that's one of the ways we see these tensions within the Confederacy play out on the battlefield. So, um, you know, there are there's a big problem with desertion in the Confederacy. It certainly peaks at different points in the war. But these kind of issues of the Confederate nation trying to keep the loyalty of its people, it's constantly trying to keep white soldiers in line. It's also dealing with rebellions that break out in southern cities from the wives of Confederate soldiers who are struggling to make ends meet. There's these bread riots. They're often called where white women will break into stores and steal food because they can't feed their families otherwise. And obviously, this is something that is affecting men on the front lines as they're reading these letters from relatives at home about the struggles. And the Confederate government is really struggling to meet all of its responsibilities to its soldiers and its families.
Yeah, it makes it sound like the actual front line of the Civil War is just a snapshot of a much larger struggle going on throughout much of the Confederate South.
Yeah, I think one thing historians have done a really good job of lately is showing how much armies depended on support from the home front. Some of that is material, obviously, in terms of supplies, but a lot of it's also emotional too. That, when you read Civil War soldiers' letters, like one of the biggest things they're always bugging their relatives at home for is why don't you write me more? Or why don't your letters come faster? Because these soldiers are really longing for that emotional connection. So especially in a place like the Confederacy where, it increasingly seems like their families at home are struggling without them, that leads to declining soldier morale, potential desertions. So the home front and the battlefront are intimately connected.
Yeah. And on another topic, the Underground Railroad is one of the most famous parts of American history, but a lot of people picture it as just being secret tunnels and encoded songs. What do a lot of people get wrong about it, and what's the real story behind it, especially in Pennsylvania?
Sure. So yeah, the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, it's one of those things that I think captures popular imagination. And it oftentimes we talk about it as kind of these terms of like safe houses, hidden tunnels, hidden compartments where people, took refuge to evade slave catchers. And that happens, to be sure. But I think when we focus on the Underground Railroad as just a series of safe houses, we miss a lot. So, for one, the Underground Railroad was actually more or less an open secret in most communities. Most of the kind of so-called routes and the abolitionists who were helping people were pretty well known in their own communities. Frederick Douglass actually in 1845 criticizes fellow abolitionists by saying that the Underground Railroad is so well known, we might as well call it the Upper Ground Railroad. Um, so, there's this kind of sense to which it's an open secret, and that raises the question of why would abolitionists be so careless, so reckless to talk about, what was a legal activity? It was illegal under federal law. There were federal fugitive slave laws. And really, I think we should remember about the Underground Railroad is it's about people. So there are these networks known as vigilance committees, which are like the single most important thing to understand about the Underground Railroad is that there were these kind of networks of black and white activists in northern cities and towns that worked together to make sure that enslaved people who escaped were, received, fed, cared for, assisted to wherever they needed to go. And that these committees were extremely well organized, extremely active. They were in regular contact with anti-slavery lawyers, and they also used state laws. The northern states had personal liberty laws, which protected. Basically, it shifted the burden of proof from enslaved people to slaveholders. A slaveholder had to prove that that person was their slave before they could take them back into slavery. So these vigilance committees mobilized these state laws to protect people. So, instead of thinking about it as kind of people hurrying from place to place in the dark of night, hiding or, secret codes, the real history of the Underground Railroad is about networks of people and about using federalism and state laws to their advantage.
That's interesting. And a lot of your other research highlights how enslaved and free Black people use the law and federal authority to carve out freedom. For example, some of this might be, like you said, shifting the burden of proof. Can you share a specific case or story that shows how they turn the system to their advantage?
Sure. So they have to choose. There's a lot to choose from. I would say there's so the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act is this draconian law that slaveholders get as part of the Compromise of 1850. And the idea is that it will create or it will add to the federal law enforcement arm all of these little officials known as U.S. commissioners who are supposed to um, capture and return people to slavery if they reach the northern states. So that's how the law is designed to work. Um, but the federal government doesn't have a centralized law enforcement arm. There's no FBI, there's no G-men at this point. So the way federal authority works is that the federal government delegates power to local men to carry out federal laws in their own communities. So a U.S. commissioner in a town in Pennsylvania might also be a lawyer, a merchant, might also be a state or local official.
Yeah.
Being a federal official is just one of the many hats he wears. So free black communities and their white allies use that to pressure these commissioners to kind of deviate from the law's harshest provisions. So, for instance, the law says that um, people who are alleged to be fugitives don't have the right to a trial. They don't have the right to a lawyer. They don't have the right to testify in their own defense. But what we see over and over again uh, is that free black communities go into these hearing rooms and they pressure these commissioners, who are, again, local men who are going to have to live with these decisions and live with their neighbors after it, to kind of go away from the harsher provisions in the law. And so it makes it that this law that was draconian in intent wasn't always that way in practice.
Yeah.
And it really frustrates slaveholders.
And this would be more specifically in the North, obviously, as like the South would be much more obviously not friendly to enslaved people.
No, that's an important distinction. So, I talked earlier about those personal liberty laws in the North. In some ways, the federal law has such a draconian and fearsome reputation, but what really matters are state laws. So you have these personal liberty laws in the North, but in the slave states, you have what they called slave codes or anti-slave stealing statutes. So under the federal 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, the maximum penalty for an abolitionist who assisted an enslaved person was 6 months in prison, which is nothing to scoff at, but 6 months in prison.
It's not
Under,
terrible.
yeah, it's not as much as you might think, but
Yeah.
in slave states, they have the state level laws. You could be facing a decade or two in prison. So Calvin Fairbanks is a abolitionist who helps enslaved people escape from Kentucky. He gets caught in the 1840s. He's still in the Kentucky State Penitentiary when the Union Army comes through in 1864. So it's very different. Like the Underground Railroad is very dangerous work in slave states. It's not so much in the North.
That's interesting. Yeah. I guess I never really thought about such a big distinction between the federal and state laws, but clearly there is a distinction there.
Yeah, and especially the slave, like the draconian, fearsome slave laws were in the slave states.
Yeah. And on another line, in your article on fugitive slave renditions, you describe a pro-slavery crisis of confidence in federalism. I thought this line was particularly interesting. And could you explain what this phrase means and how these conflicts between states and the federal government push the country closer to war?
Sure. So in the pro-slavery crisis of confidence in federalism, what I mean is this. So as I talked about, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act doesn't go as slaveholders planned. Um, they were hoping that these federal officials could kind of derail the Underground Railroad. That was the whole plan, was to bring the power of the federal government to force the northern states to comply. And what they realize pretty quickly after that law is passed and after they see how kind of the enforcement is so very different, the gap between what they envisioned and what they're getting because of these local men with local sympathies being pressured away from the harsher provisions of the law, is really, that gap is really large. So slaveholders start to doubt by the mid to late 1850s um, whether they never doubt that the federal government is on their side. They have during this period, Franklin Pierce, Roger Taney, James Buchanan are senior, officials in the federal government. They are all pro-slavery. They are
Yeah.
all doing everything they can to appease slaveholders. So slaveholders don't doubt that the federal government is still in their corner, but they do start to doubt whether any federal commitment, no matter how strong, is enough to bring northern states into line. So what I argue happens in this decade with the fugitive slave crisis is that slaveholders start to become convinced that slavery is not secure within a federalist system that allows room for local dissent on slavery. So that allows northern states to have these personal liberty laws or to, tolerate the, anti-slavery voices in the North. So
Yeah.
you notice they try to make some of these changes first in their kind of final demands before leaving the Union. One of them is they want a constitutional amendment overriding all the northern state personal liberty laws. which is ironic if you ever hear the argument about Southerners seceded for states' rights. They're advocating for this massive expansion of federal power
Yeah.
to protect slavery. And then when they secede in the Confederate Constitution, they make it so that only the central government in Richmond can control slavery. Individual states can't abolish slavery. So they're taking these lessons from the 1850s that you can't have local dissent on slavery. It has to be a strong central state that is controlling that issue.
That's interesting. Yeah.